Welcome everyone, and hello to those of you that have joined us this afternoon for Tech UK's session on Voice Biometrics, the future of authentication. My name is Catherine Holden. I am the head of data analytics, artificial intelligence and digital identity at Tech UK, and I will also be the moderator for today's session. We're delighted to be joined by three panelists. We have Philip Black, who is the commercial director at Nomidio, Mark Bosworth, who is the Business Development Manager at Aculab, and Dr. Phil Harrison, who is a lecturer in the Department of Language and Linguistic Science at the University of York. So thanks so much for joining me today. Just quickly, in terms of background, I think it's probably worth highlighting, obviously, the importance of this type of contactless technology, especially since the start of the pandemic 18 months ago. I think the opportunities sort of surrounding this technology are fairly easy for customers to grasp because it can really lead to a positive and sort of seamless customer experience. But I think it's worth also noting that there have been questions in the past around the technology's safety and effectiveness, and this is something which, as part of our panel discussion today, we will be addressing. It's worth also flagging that here at Tech UK, we're carrying out a lot of work in this area. We have a facial recognition and biometrics working group, and also our digital identity working group, which is really looking at how do we ensure this technology can be adopted and scaled safely and responsibly. And if you'd like to find out more about either of those groups, then please just drop me a message after this session and we can look how we can get you involved. So before we begin, just to let you know the structure of how this the next hour will run, we're going to do a series of very short presentations from each of the panelists, followed by a bit of a Q&A discussion. And we're really keen to make this session as interactive as possible. So please, if you have any questions, either type them into the chat function, or feel free to raise your virtual hand, and I'll be able to take you off mute so you can ask your questions to the panelists directly. But now I would like to just hand over to our first speaker, Mark Bosworth from Aculab, to give his short presentation. Thank you. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll just share my screen and get the slides going. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to Tech UK for giving us the opportunity to contribute this afternoon. For my part of the session, I would like to give a brief overview of voice biometrics as a technology, some of the advantages and some of the reasons for using it. Before I go into the sort of technical part of the presentation, a brief anecdote from one of my colleagues who I was speaking with last week. On the day I was talking to him that morning, he'd had reason to phone his bank, one of the big 4 UK banks, and he'd been speaking with an agent, done whatever he needed to do. At the end of the call, the agent said, as you know, the call today has been recorded for quality and training purposes. Do you mind if we use the recording to enroll your voice PIN? He agreed, and that was the end of the call. So quite painless, quite efficient, and he subsequently managed to authenticate himself seamlessly with his voice, which is a great example of background passive enrollment with voice biometrics. So a bit more about what it is and how it works. So voice biometrics then is the science behind the measurement and analysis of a person's voice. All of our voices are unique in the same way as fingerprints and other
Mark, you've muted yourself, I'm afraid.
Sorry, guys.
Oh, apologies. We missed the beginning there, Mark. Sorry.
The beginning of this slide, or?
Yeah, maybe start from the beginning of this slide, if that's okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know quite how I did that. But yes, what is voice biometrics? Voice biometrics essentially is the measurement and analysis of a person's voice. All of our voices are unique in the same way as fingerprints and other biometrics, and some of the aspects, behavioural and physical, which influence the way we articulate words and speak, are illustrated on the slide here. And because of that uniqueness, our voices can be used as a factor of authentication in the same way as we can use fingerprint identification, etc. One of the other big advantages with voice is the fact that it can be used over any type of telephone device. It doesn't have to be a smartphone. It can be a landline. It can be a computer or tablet with a microphone input. So any device with a microphone input can be used to work with this type of technology. And because of the my slides are frozen. Let me just escape from the presentation a second and restart it again. Down. Can you still hear me, Catherine?
Yeah, we can still hear you. Yeah, it's moved on to the next slide.
Yeah, apologies for that. Yeah, because of the uniqueness of our voices, we can use voice for biometric authentication or verification. And the way it works is that the person using the system, first of all, has to enroll in the system. And that's done by capturing some audio, capturing some recordings of the person's voice. The system then analyzes the voice, extracts some features and creates a voice print, which is stored along with a user ID for future comparison. So when the caller phones back in, as my colleague did, into the bank, the system can compare their current voice print with the saved one and give a response as to whether it is the person who they claim to be or not. Some of the benefits of using voice biometrics are listed here. There are quite a few benefits. These are some of the main ones, but the disadvantages and vulnerability of PINs and passwords for accessing accounts is widely acknowledged. Voice biometrics as a technology, along with other techniques, can be used to mitigate against some of the pitfalls and some of the risks of that approach. But as well as some of the advantages that are listed on the slide here, in a contact center environment, biometrics can be used to reduce the amount of questions that are asked by an agent, thus freeing up agent time, thus reducing the call time and improving the customer experience. But also, as we are in this so-called new way of working, with all of us working remotely and contact center agents working remotely, etc., this type of technology can be used for agents to authenticate themselves onto the system, as well as for customers to authenticate themselves into their account. Some of the key advantages of this type of technology are that because it's working on the underlying patterns of a person's speech, it is language independent. It's not looking at the language when a person is speaking, the dialect they're speaking, or what they're saying. It's completely independent of those factors. So it can be deployed anywhere in the world with any dialect. It's also omnichannel. So as we've already said, doesn't have to be used with any particular type of specialist equipment. It can be a modern smartphone, it can be an old-fashioned type of mobile phone, landline, tablet, or web interface. So very flexible in terms of the usage channel. And there are several modes of operation. The most commonly used is what is known as text dependent or active mode, where the caller is asked to repeat a fixed passphrase. This, as I say, is the most common mode in use at the moment, but gaining in popularity is the text independent or passive mechanism, which I described earlier, where background conversational speech is used. So as the caller is speaking with an agent or speaking with an automated system, their speech can be recorded, and that can then be used to enroll their voice print and subsequently authenticate themselves. That provides a very seamless, painless way of doing things. The final version is, or final mechanism is text prompted, where the caller is prompted to repeat a random series of digits. This has the additional advantages of liveness detection. So not only is the caller's response used to verify or authenticate themselves with their voice print, the system can also check that they are repeating the correct sequence of digits in the correct order. One of the key questions, particularly in the current climate that we're all living in, with data breaches and hacks going on all the time, is how secure is this type of technology? And the simple answer is that fundamentally this type of technology is very secure. Voice biometric systems use encrypted communications and connections. No voice recordings are saved, so there's no personal data of that type. It's only the voice prints which are saved, and the voice prints themselves can't be reverse engineered. There's no way of rebuilding the customer's voice from that voice print. So as I say, fundamentally a high degree of security, and of course all systems are open to attack, and some of the threats against biometric systems are, particularly voice biometric systems, there are three main types of attack. The first one is where some recorded audio is used to try and get into a person's account. So the same audio is presented that's been presented before. The second type B, is where somebody tries to impersonate the caller's voice, or splice together snippets of their recorded voice to present to the system to try and gain entry. And finally, and very topically these days, is the use of synthetically generated speech, or so-called deep fakes, which can be very convincing to a human ear, but voice biometric systems have got built-in algorithms to guard against this type of approach. As I say, we combat against these various types of presentation attacks or spoof attacks with built-in algorithms analysing the incoming speech, looking to detect various artifacts which could indicate that it's a recorded piece of speech, or that it's been a recording spliced together, or that it's a synthetically generated piece of speech. And testing shows that modern voice biometric systems are very effective in defending against these type of attacks. Okay, so that concludes my brief presentation. Sorry about the technical glitches. Hope that's given you a flavour for the technology. But I will now stop sharing my.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark, for a really, really brilliant and comprehensive overview there. And do not worry about the technical hiccup at the beginning. I think we're all very used to that in this current day of age, and it wouldn't be one of these virtual calls without the tech going a little wrong at some point. So no problems there. I think there's a lot of questions there and bits I want to sort of unpack further as part of the Q&A. Huge thank you. But now I'd like to hand it over to Philip Black for his short presentation. Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. So are we up and running?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, my name's Philip Black. I'm from Nomidio. Nomidio is a cloud-hosted identity service business. So we provide digital identities as a service, and you'll see the relevance of that to the voice biometrics world as I progress shortly. Having digital identities, we are clearly using voice biometrics front and center as part of what we do. But I'd like to sort of start really about talking about what is a digital identity, and start with some sort of fundamentals really. In the case of a digital identity, there are sort of three players really. The first being you, the individual, that wants to have an identity or that has an identity, and typically you'll have some sort of identity proof, whether that be a password, a simple boring password as using to prove your identity, or your voice, or other elements that you'll have that you want to use to prove your identity. The other two players then are what I call the identity checker, which is whoever it is that wants to verify that who you are. So that might be it might be a business that you're talking to, it might be British Gas when you phone them up, it might be your bank, it might be Amazon when you log in to your Amazon account, or Yahoo if you've got a Yahoo account. Whoever you want to interact with is going to check your identity. And then the other player is the identity provider, and that's really the party that is going to take the request to check who you are and match your identity proof that you're presenting against your registered identity to confirm whether you really are that person or not. And that's a rather simplistic sort of view of it, but the basics of how digital identities are deployed. And the reality of where we are today is that, first of all, I'd say the vast majority of the ID proof that people have to prove their digital identity is rather sadly the boring old password, which is a pretty outdated and, as we know, insecure and rather vulnerable way of proving your ID. And the other element of this, which is somewhat difficult, is that I think in virtually every case at the moment, the identity checker and the identity provider are the same entity. So when I log into my, let's say, Amazon account, I'm logging into Amazon, and Amazon is using itself to prove my identity by checking that the password that I give them matches the password that I created when I set up my my Amazon account. And there's a real issue there with the identity provider and the checker being the same person. Means that my identity with Amazon is really only good for logging in with Amazon. So I can't use the same identity to log into a different identity checker. Maybe that's Google. I want to log into Google. Google uses itself as its identity provider, and they store the password that I've given them. So that means that I have to then have a different digital identity for every single identity checker that I want to interact with, which is kind of ridiculous when you look at it like that. I did a check this morning. I use a password manager to manage passwords because I can't remember passwords. And at the moment, I have 286 digital identities, which is just ridiculous and crazy. But the reality that we all kind of have fallen into without any sort of alternative, as it were. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. And I guess the interesting piece there is around the ID proof and what you have as your ID proof. And obviously we're here talking about voice biometrics, and voice biometrics are a very valid and strong case for using for ID proof. And that's indeed part of what we do with Nomidio as part of the ID proof. So what do we have as a digital identity? With the Nomidio cloud, when we create a digital identity, there are a number of factors that we use to create that identity. First of all, there's an identifier, which is kind of who you're claiming to be, which in a typical world that'll be your username, which often is your email, or it might be your phone number, or a combination of those. That really is kind of who you're claiming to be when you want to log in. And then the factors that we bring together to create that identity are at the moment are a voice print, a face print, control of an email address. So, for example, we'll send you an email to confirm that you genuinely have the email you're claiming, and likewise a phone number. So those four elements then come together to be the ID proof. And you see, voice is a key part of that. In terms of how we might actually use that, in order to actually enact an authentication of myself, here's just a brief example of if I'm logging into a system. I'm using my mobile phone in this case, and you'll see we just go through a simple process of gathering the different elements that go to prove my identity. So I'm asked to give a face print, so I'm giving a live capture of my face, and then a voice print, and I'm asked to repeat a particular phrase there, and then those are gathered by Nomidio and used to check against the identity that we've created for you. So that's all very well, and it's a very compact and neat way and simple way to prove your identity, including that use of voice and face biometrics. The question really then is about how you get to use that and how that digital identity can be used across channels. And that's really the sort of fundamental tenet of a digital ID. Is I don't want it to be specific to a channel and specific to a particular company or a particular website. I want it to be able to be deployed across a number of different things. So that may be, I maybe want to use it as an employee when I log in the morning, when I do my single sign-on, when I log into Microsoft 365, or if I log into Salesforce or whatever other corporate infrastructure that I use. But also, I'm me, and my, as a individual, as a customer, I want my identity to still be the same thing when I phone up British Gas, let's say, and want to identify myself on a call center, or maybe when I'm on chat or interacting with a chat bot, and also when I'm whenever I'm logging in anywhere on the web of my 286 different places where I want to log in. I'd like it to be me, a single digital identity that gets used. And it's quite important then that ability to serve that those biometric checks effectively are feasible across these different channels. So briefly, what that might look like if you were using Nomidio to log in this case, let's say to Salesforce. This is a typical flow of how it works, and you'll see this is the three participants that I've talked about earlier, in that I go to my browser, whether it be on the laptop or my phone, and decide I want to log into Salesforce, let's say, and that goes to Salesforce. Salesforce then asks Nomidio to authenticate me. Then Nomidio interacts with me directly via my browser, as you've seen. I'm asked to present voice and face prints, which Nomidio then checks against my identity and then goes back to Salesforce and confirms who I am and that I authenticate against that identity. And Salesforce can then log me in. So from a user perspective, I've just gone to Salesforce, given a voice and face print on my mobile, and I'm logged in without having to provide any other information. The other element of that, which is obviously strong here, is that because Nomidio is separate from, in this case, Salesforce, they're not the same entity. It means that I have a single identity with my voice print, face print identifying me that can be used in those multiple different places. So some of the key elements of that, of providing a biometric identity. One of the things that we think is important is, as Mark alluded to earlier, voice biometrics are really strong and probably one of the most widely used and strongest in terms of their efficacy against being hacked or spoofed. but we still like to have multiple factors to enhance that security. And at the moment, we have 2 factors. So we do a face biometric check as well as a voice check, regardless of the channel that you're coming to, whether it be phoning up a contact center or logging into Salesforce or on the web or whatever. We use those multiple biometric factors to increase the security of your identity. And hand in hand with that is we have a thing that we call biometric agility, where the nature of our security check evolve, and so we think it's very important that the identity provider has the ability to enhance the security as things evolve. So I'm sure 10 years ago, if you said we're going to do voice biometrics, it would be that is massively secure and that's enough. Today we might want to say, well, actually we have more factors because we want to be sure of that. In 10 years time, who knows where we'll be. We may have the ability for voices and faces to be faked in slightly easier. So we want to add additional factors. So we have the ability within the platform to add additional factors, biometric and other, to enhance the security of that identity as it goes along. And I think that's very important, that when you're talking about a digital identity, that it's for life, really. So we don't want it to be stuck in the past and becoming more and more insecure as technology evolves. So the ability to have additional factors and security levels built into it as it evolves is very important. The other thing that is pretty important as well, and this plays particularly around voice biometrics amongst others, is that I want to be able to use my identity across different channels. I want it to be independent. I don't want to have to use my home phone. I think I've still got a home phone. I'm not sure, to be honest. But I don't want to have to use my home phone every time I speak to a particular contact center. I don't want to have to use my phone if I'm logging on to a website. I don't want to speak to a website. It's not really feasible. So I want to be independent of the channel that I'm connecting to when I come to prove my identity. And likewise, I don't want to be tied to a particular device. So whilst we're quite sort of mobile centric in terms of, I think we're all quite familiar with our mobile phones are our soul, almost, in a sad way. And a lot of people are tied to them in some ways. It's quite a vulnerability. If you lose your phone, if the battery's dead when you come to want to do something, God forbid that we might have digital biometrics on entry to country, and you sit on the phone on the plane on your phone and run the battery down, and then you can't get into the country because your phone's dead, so you can't prove who you are. So I want to be device independent when it comes to proving my identity. And again, that's a key factor within the way that the Nomidio cloud works, is that it allows you to be independent of the device, because your identity is stored in the cloud centrally rather than sitting on a particular device. And then finally, the nitty gritty. I don't want to have to use an app. I don't want to have to download an app just to prove my identity. If I'm using my mobile phone, I want it to be device app independent. I want to be able to use my laptop, for example, to prove my identity when I'm logging in at work if I don't have my phone with me, and I don't want to have to download an app in order to do that. So all of those things come together really to prove the identity and to have a platform that is feasible for managing identity. But with that being a central repository for identity, there's some sort of responsibilities that come with that, really, in providing that. And those are the real sort of pillars that Nomidio operates by. And they are accessibility, so that obviously we're in the cloud, so that everybody can access and use the service in order for you to authenticate yourself. So it's very important that we're not sitting on-prem with a particular provider and not open to others to use. Obviously, it's got to be reliable, because ID is a 24/7 thing. So obviously, we sit in Nomidio is actually hosted in AWS. It sits across multiple availability zones and is a high availability system that has high reliability. And with that, it needs to be secure as well. And security is probably the most focused on element of that, because we are sat as a single place for you to store your identity. We're very aware of that, but we're very keen that it's understood that that's what we do, and so it is front and central for us to create a secure environment. And indeed, the security, I'd suggest that we're very focused on it and only focused on that, whereas all the other places where you currently have your IDs. So, you know, my ID has been stolen multiple times. I know I have a Yahoo ID, and that was part of the leak when Yahoo managed to lose a whole load of credentials, which is your identity. And I'd suggest that most businesses don't have the security of digital identities as their prime aim, prime focus, and prime experience. So we're quite happy to actually say that that's where we focus. And indeed, the system is architected from the bottom up to be highly secure. It sits within a virtual private cloud within AWS. The entire system is encrypted. The data is encrypted both at rest and in transit. And in an additional layer on that, every single identity that's held within the system is also encrypted. So it's double encrypted. And each identity that's encrypted is encrypted with a separate key, which is specific and owned by each individual. And then the final tenet there really is independence. And this is probably the most controversial or most concerning, I suppose, in terms of I want my identity to be managed in a way which isn't vulnerable either to misuse by organisations. I don't want Facebook, for example, to manage my identity, given their track record of misusing people's identities for all sorts of things. I don't want my identity being used to track me for marketing activities, and so I like the independence of not being a major company that has ulterior motive. And likewise, I don't want my identity managed by the government either. You know, as a state operator, I don't think that they should have the right to control and have access to my identity. And that's very specific to the idea of using my identity to authenticate myself where I go, rather than the more state view of identifying individuals. So I guess I'll sort of leave with the sort of the last thought on that, really, that as a trusted guardian, which is where Nomidio sees itself as a trusted guardian of identities, we focus entirely, exclusively, and solely on authentication rather than identification. And that is about you present yourself and ask to be authenticated against your identity at your request, which is what we do. And what we don't do is look for individuals in a crowd, if you like, to be presented with either a sea of voices or a picture of a crowd and say, please tell me who these people are. That's really not what the identification piece is about for us. So just to be clear on that. So that concludes what I have to say about Nomidio and identity as a service.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philip. And as I said, we're hopefully going to be able to squeeze some time in at the end for a bit of a Q&A. So I'd like to now hand over to our final speaker, Dr. Phil Harrison, for his presentation. In the meantime, do start getting your thinking caps on for questions and start popping those in the chat so that I can make sure they're allocated to different speakers during this session. So Philip, over to you. Great.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that on the slide?
Yeah.
Great. So thanks for having me here today, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking about voice biometrics from a slightly different perspective from the forensic context, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of kind of the underlying technology and the usefulness of some of the research that I'm going to be talking about. So, as Catherine said, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Language and Linguistic Science at the University of York, and we have a long-established forensic speech science group there, where we're focusing on all kinds of aspects to do with speech that might crop up in the forensic or the court or law enforcement situation. So we run the world's only master's level MSc course in forensic speech science, which has been going since 2007, and as part of that we have very strong partnerships both with forensic labs and the speech tech industry. So the first company up there, JP French Associates, is heavily involved in the department. I've also worked there for the past 20 odd years, and also with Aculab, as we've already heard about, and Nuance and Phonexia. So we're also very research focused within this group, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of the projects that we've been working on or are going to be working on, and that ranges all the way from our undergrad students doing projects through to the master's students who all have to do a end of year project, through to PhDs, and then kind of multi-year externally funded projects. And we kind of bring a bit of a different outlook. So a lot of the technology that's been talked about is developed by engineering departments, kind of tech focused engineering companies. But what we're looking at is bringing our insights from the areas that we're specialist in, so speech science, phonetics and linguistics, to help us better understand how these systems are working, and also to improve their performance. And as I said, mainly in the kind of the forensic domain. So what do we do most often in this field? And as a kind of practical application, that would be forensic speaker comparison. So that's applying voice biometrics, the idea that your identity can be kind of stored in your voice, and using that in a forensic context. So we're usually going to be asked something like, can we compare a recorded voice of an unknown criminal with a known suspect? So that unknown criminal voice could be anything like a fraudulent telephone call to a bank, dealings with an undercover police officer purchasing drugs, CCTV footage of a bank robbery, those kind of things. And then usually the known suspect recording would be something like a police interview recording, or another recording where the identity isn't in question. And so the result from this comparison is then going to go forwards as evidence in court, in usually a criminal trial. Now, this work has traditionally been done by human analysts, kind of people who would work in the linguistics department, who are analysing and comparing the recordings using linguistic phonetic parameters. So things like how the people are pronouncing vowel and consonant sounds, what their voice pitch is like, what the overall quality of their voice is, if they've got a nasal voice or a creaky voice, a harsh voice, those kind of things. But as the kind of biometric automatic technology has developed, this is becoming increasingly adopted within this kind of work, and most often as well in combination with the more traditional approaches. And so this is termed automatic speaker recognition, or ASR. And it's basically using the same underlying technologies and principles that Mark introduced. I'm not going to kind of go into the details, but we're using it here in the kind of identification context. Now, there are some definite benefits, again, as Mark had already pointed out, for why we might want to use some automatic approaches. They have very good performance, i.e. very low error rates when we use them in ideal conditions. So things like lots of speech, very good quality, clear recordings can get fantastic performance. They're also very fast. So the kind of human analysis that I talked about could take anywhere up to about 15 hours just to compare two recordings, whereas this can be a matter of seconds, if that. These systems are also very easily testable because they're fast, so we can understand the performance, we can know how well these systems behave and what their limitations might be, which is obviously a lot harder for human analysts if it's taking them 15 hours to do one comparison. Also, it's replicable and not dependent on an analyst. There are, however, some downsides to these kind of approaches, particularly in the forensic context. And one is that these systems are seen quite often as a kind of black box, in that it's difficult to explain precisely in easily understandable terms what aspects of the speech signal is being compared, how it's being compared, and how the results are arrived at. And that's obviously important in a court situation where we need and want to be able to explain the basis of the results. Also, some of the situations we have to deal with recordings from are less than ideal for working with these kind of systems. So we can find very poor performance sometimes in some very extreme and difficult conditions. And something else we find as well is that we can actually get different performance for different speakers. So some speakers are better suited or can be more easily identified than others, and that can also be different across different systems. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an introduction and flavour. I now wanted to talk about some of the research projects that we've done and that we're involved in that are trying to address some of those issues and kind of drive the field forward. So the first of these is a project that's now finished, which was called Voice and Identity Source Filter Biometrics. And this was looking at a kind of systematic comparison of the performance between automatic speaker recognition systems and the more traditional linguistic phonetic approaches that I talked about, looking at them in both in isolation and combination and seeing what benefits we can get from combining them. And perhaps not surprisingly, we found that the automatic approaches achieved the best performance overall. This wasn't pitting human against machine, but kind of the human elements that we could very easily and quickly replicate over and over again. We found when we combined our ASR systems with some of the linguistic phonetic measures relating to our vocal tract, so from our larynx to the lips, that didn't really improve our performance. So really we concluded there we're measuring the same information twice, but in two different but not independent ways. But when we start measuring and comparing things to do with the larynx, so our source, we're getting improvements for some speakers. So that's suggesting that adding these features can increase our performance. And also, helpfully, where we were getting a few errors made by the automatic systems, we found that these could actually easily be resolved using linguistic methods. So again, there's definitely extra information that our linguistic approaches can add. Now, a current project which is actually running in collaboration with Aculab is being run by a PhD student, Elliot Holmes, and his project is titled Towards Linguistically Informed Automatic Speaker Recognition. So this is a kind of follow-on from the previous project I spoke about. And at the moment, he's developing a tool which is going to automatically or is automatically extracting lots of potentially useful phonetic features from recordings. And the important thing about this tool is that it's kind of automatic and scalable. So it's removing a lot of that kind of human time and effort from the analysis. And he's then taking that data and doing some systematic comparisons to see what the performance of these different features are across different speech sounds, as I said, different vowels and consonants, and also across different speakers and recordings. So looking at what are the best parameters for differentiating speakers. And then the final stage of his project is going to be combining those most useful features with the automatic systems to not only improve the performance, but also kind of shed some light on the black box issue and provide some sort of more interpretability. Have another colleague who's looking at this from a kind of slightly different aspect in terms of looking much more at the anatomy. So Amelia's project is called Anatomy, Acoustics and the Individual, investigating in-speaker vocal tract variation for forensic speaker comparison. And she's interested in answering questions such as which parts of the vocal anatomy have the most impact upon our speaker discriminatory features. So this is the idea that our vocal apparatus is fixed, although we use it kind of in a flexible way, but which parts of it are giving us the most speaker discriminatory information. And also looking at the overall kind of anatomical variation that exists across speakers. This isn't something that we know a huge deal about in any great level of detail. And then kind of importantly from the application perspective is how, to what extent are these differences actually detectable by a whole range of people? So naive listeners, forensic experts, and then automatic speaker recognition systems. So she's working, as you can maybe hopefully see on the top right, using MRI data scans, so putting people in MRI scanners, getting them to speak and recording them, taking that information and creating three-dimensional vocal tract models, which can then be manipulated, used to understand this variation, and also to generate speech from them. So if you're interested in that, I recommend you go and check out her website, ameliagully.com, for lots more interesting pictures and background. And then a final project I wanted to talk about is something that we have planned for the future called person-specific automatic speaker recognition and understanding the behaviour of individual speakers for applications of ASR. So this goes back to the issue that kind of some people are more easily identified by ASR systems than others. So we want to look into what specific factors make a voice easy or difficult for an ASR system to recognise. And so as well, looking into kind of how consistent results we can get for individual speakers when factors like time of day, stress, health, all those things are kind of changing, and also across different systems as well. And hopefully then with those insights, we can then tailor systems and approaches so that they work better for individuals, in the ultimate aim of then improving performance across the board for all speakers. And we're going to be doing this by using both highly controlled and uncontrolled kind of forensically realistic recordings. So I hope that gave you kind of a quick idea of the sort of things that we're looking into. And I guess this is really sort of looking forward to the future. And at least as I see it, I think it's only going to kind of improve in terms of kind of performance, especially from the engineering perspective, in terms of things like algorithm development, more artificial intelligence, more deep neural networks, that kind of technology being employed in these systems, and also as testing and development's done with even more diverse and harder and larger data sets. And as well, coupled with the kinds of things that we've been talking about, the insights that we're able to provide. So again, the improved performance through combining these systems with linguistic phonetic features that are potentially be tailored to individuals. And that's also going to provide greater transparency and greater understanding. There's then a kind of feedback loop to further develop the systems, and also better understanding of that individual performance and variability, which is kind of a key aspect when we're looking at this from a forensic perspective and are dealing with just one voice in a particular case. So thank you.
Brilliant. Huge thank you, Philip. Great presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone does have any questions, please do raise them in the chat now. Unfortunately, we only have sort of about 10 minutes for questions today, so I think we'll do a bit of a rapid quick fire, bringing all the panelists back. Excellent. So maybe, Mark, starting with you, thank you for your presentation. I'd be really keen to hear, sort of from your perspective, what sectors do you think will most benefit from voice biometrics in the near future?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Well, to date, it's been banking, financial services, and government departments really that have seen the biggest take-up of voice biometrics. I think in the short to medium term, we're going to see an increase in more everyday applications of voice biometrics. So, areas such as utilities, more expansion into financial services, more expansion into different government departments, etc. Social services maybe. So yeah, I think we're kind of on the cusp of a sort of mainstream adoption of this type of technology. Once people start using it and really understand how easy it can be, and how it improves things. So yeah, that's my thought on the short to medium term.
Thanks, Mark. Just maybe as a quick follow-up on that as well, for those that are maybe on the call who are maybe less familiar with how this technology works, how much of a caller's speech is needed for enrolment or for verification purposes?
Yeah, typically with many of the systems that are currently in use, which use the text-dependent method, so that the caller is prompted to repeat a specific passphrase. These passphrases are 3 to 4 seconds long. So for enrolment purposes, the caller would need to repeat that maybe 3 or 4 times to enroll, and then for verification, just 1 repetition. For background passive enrolment, conversational speech, typically we're talking about between 25 and 40 seconds worth of speech, of recording, which includes silences, but that can obviously be taken over several utterances. So as the caller is giving information to an agent or to a system, or answering questions. Certainly some of the testing that we've done has given extremely good results with sort of 20-25 seconds worth of enrolled speech.
Fantastic! That's absolutely incredible. I can't believe it's such a short amount of time. That's fascinating. Maybe Philip, if I can come to you now and the work you're doing at Nomidio. You mentioned as part of your presentation kind of the emergence of deep fakes. I'd be really interested. We're certainly seeing these becoming increasingly more realistic or effective over time, and I've certainly fallen for a few of them, I'm sure, on various social media sites. What impact do you think the emergence of deep fakes will have on the effectiveness of voice biometrics going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can certainly remember. I'm sure lots of people have seen Barack Obama swearing on the internet as the first emergence of deep fake in public. It's interesting because I think the reality, and Mark alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that to the human eye and the human ear, these deep fakes seem incredibly convincing. And I suspect our brain does a lot of processing to allow us to believe that they're real. But on a digital level, they're really quite distinguishable. And it is, whilst they may be good fakes, they're not that good a fake. So, in that sense, I don't think they're really a near-time threat. It may be in the future they do become a stronger threat as they become more sophisticated. And the other side to that, I would say, is that that's part of the reason that within Nomidio we have multiple factors. So we take a voice, and the voice is kind of front and central of the biometric profile that we build. But we also have a face print. And it's an exponentially more challenging effort to try and present a voice and a face from different sources at the same time, not at the same time, consecutively in the process of authentication. Plus we add additional factors. We actually have the sort of kind of the MFA factors going on in the background of using security keys and direct interactions that have been established when you register. So I think that the vector of a deep fake, I think by having multiple factors, we really build up a stronger resilience to them ever really being credible.
Thank you, Philip. That's really helpful, and it's good to hear that you, as you mentioned, as a part of your presentation, this multifactorial approach to the security aspect, which is very encouraging and reassuring. Philip, maybe if I can come on to you and some of the research you're doing in your area, which was a brilliant presentation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts. One concern I know people have around voice biometric is how viable the technology will be sort of in the long term as people's voices sort of change with age as they grow older. Have you got any thoughts on the viability of this technology into the future?
Well, yeah, there's certainly been research that colleagues have done looking into this, and yes, the performance of both human analysts and machines does decline with age because the voice is changing. But I think in terms of kind of the timescales, is that the technology is actually moving ahead so rapidly that it isn't going to be the case that you would enroll your voice now and you would still be using the same voice print in 10 years time. That the technology will have moved on, and it will need, because the recordings aren't being stored as well, that you would need to create a new voice print. So in that situation, I don't really see the problem there. In the forensic one, if we have a historic recording that we need to compare with someone now, then yes, potentially more of an issue. But in the kind of user authentication scenario, I see the technology will just develop quicker than the voice will change and degrade.
Fantastic, excellent. That's what we like to hear.
I think also, Catherine, make a point on that with the system progressing, what we tend to do is that we, as someone uses and authenticates with the system and they're giving voice samples, we actually go through and update their reference sample at a not every time, but at a frequency that means that we're never more than a year or 6 months out of date with the current person's live voice. So there's a sort of administrative mechanism where we're staying in touch with the person as they age, to make sure that we don't suffer from any sort of degradation on voices like that.
Excellent. That sounds like a brilliant feature. We're very quickly, in fact, running out of time. So I think I'm going to leave it with one final question for you all, starting maybe with you, Philip Harrison, which is, from your perspective, what does the future, is a big question, so it's going to be hard to answer, but what does the future hold for voice biometrics from your perspective?
I think just a lot more use, much more widely accepted in courts. The technology is just getting better and better all the time. So yeah, more and in more places.
Excellent, thank you, Philip. And Philip Black.
Goodbye to passwords. Let's just get to the point where I would like to see everybody using digital identities involving voice biometrics and others to get rid of just having to use stupid old passwords as a way of proving your identity. Bring it on. It's available now. Get on and do it. Let's bring it forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. Wise words there. And Mark, I'll give you the final line.
Yeah, it would certainly be good to look forward to not using passwords anymore, because unlike Philip, I can't remember passwords either. But yeah, I mean, I would echo really what Phil said, that wider and wider adoption in more everyday use cases for voice biometrics, and some of the emerging technologies. I mean, we're already using smart devices in our homes very readily. I see voice biometrics having more of a role to play in that space, in the Internet of Things, and then with things like driverless vehicles coming along and things like that, then voice biometrics lends itself to access of and control of vehicles and such like. So yeah, quite exciting developments in the future, I think.
Fantastic. It's good to hear that the future is bright. That's what I like to hear. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for. So I would like to say a huge thank you to my panelists, to Mark, to Philip and to Phil for your excellent presentations and your quick fire answers to my questions. We've managed to get through a few in the time we had. Obviously, anyone who's listening to this session today, if you'd like to hear more about what my panelists are doing, then please do check out their website, so Aculab, Nomidio and the University of York. I'm very happy to put people in contact after this session as well, if that would be helpful. But huge thanks for everyone for participating today and coming along in today's session, and have a brilliant afternoon. Thank you all.